News junkies from around the world have been paying attention to the events in Iran, but this time not from the work of professional journalists, instead the work of citizen journalists who are monitoring the protests after the government of Iran kicked out all the regular journalists. Now this, is a big change for the way events are normally covered. Normally, the big news organization will send lots of people in. So news organizations have to watch for citizen media. How are things changing, and how is the situation going to affect future political movements around the globe? Let's talk to a few technology journalists. We bring in Jonathan Strickland from HowStuffWorks.com. Jonathan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Also, we bring in Cyrus Farivar from everywhere, let's be honest. He works for PRI. He's a freelance technology journalist, works for The Economist, works for everyone. Cyrus, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So this situation has evolved over the last week and a half. Now the government of Iran is cracking down on citizen journalists, arresting them, taking their cameras, all those different things that you might see like in situations like Burma with normal journalists. And Jonathan, before the show we were talking, and you had mentioned, regular people like you and me who don't really travel outside the country, just pay attention, they can actually help. What are some of the things you've kind of seen around the web and, anonymous proxy servers and whatnot?
Sure. When when the protesters began to react to the election shortly thereafter, you started seeing people on Twitter post up URLs to proxy servers, which at the very beginning was working fairly well. I mean, you had some very prominent Twitter people mentioning these things, people like Stephen Fry and Neil Gaiman, folks who have a lot of followers. But as it was pointed out pretty shortly thereafter, that was not the best way to get that information out, because the Iranian government began to monitor those Twitter feeds and began to block off those proxy servers almost as soon as they were popping up. And now you're starting to hear about things like there's this great software program called Siphon, and that's out of Ottawa, Canada. And what Siphon does is you can run the software on any normal computer, and that will turn it into a proxy server. So anyone who's outside of a firewall could run this program and then provide an address to someone who is behind a firewall. They could access that as if it were a normal proxy server, and then be able to get information out to the internet that way. So
and they wouldn't have any government control. The whole idea of a proxy server is it bypasses. You use my computer, and your connection is private. It's secure or whatever.
Right.
And then you use my connection to access the internet. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Now, Cyrus, what's your take? You're constantly traveling. I follow you on Twitter. I see you in places all over the world. You just got back this week to your hometown. But what's your perspective on how social media has kind of changed things in Iran, and kind of give me your take on the situation in general?
Well, I think it's a really interesting situation. I mean, you have to remember that what's going on in Iran now is in a lot of ways a culmination of what's been happening over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years. Iran, unfortunately, has the dubious honor of being the first country in the world to arrest a blogger. That happened back in 2003. So all of this discussion of proxy servers and getting around government filters and using various kind of technology tricks to get around these types of blockages is a good example of how many people in Iran have had a lot of practice over the years. So what we're seeing now is examples of people who do know how to get around government filters, do know how to use tools like Siphon, do know how to use things like SSH tunneling and things like that to make their voices heard.
And this is really the first instance where we've seen social media play a more significant role than it has in the past. Of course, there are things like that Hudson plane crash where the first images leaked through TwitPic. Someone took a picture and posted it to Twitter, and we've seen other social media instances. This is really the first politically charged, not revolution to say, but revolution in the sense of social media as a new tool. Now, Cyrus, do you think that governments are definitely around the world are looking at Iran, and you think of places like North Korea or China, where there's still big restrictions on the media. Do you think that governments are getting ideas on how to better crack down against these people, or is that even a futile attempt to really fix a problem that they can't control at this point?
Well, I think that that governments definitely are aware of the effects of social media and social networking. Just not only in terms of espionage and monitoring, so the government can monitor what people are saying and doing, but also it gives the government an opportunity, unfortunately, to kind of co-opt that media as well. I mean, just today I was reporting on a story that will air later today on Public Radio International's The World about how there's been lots of fake Twitter messages and other kind of campaign of disinformation and misinformation as a way to confuse people, to say, for example, the protest is happening at such and such time at such and such place. Oh no, it's actually happening at this other time at this other place. And nobody can be sure whether or not that's kind of just an innocent mistake, yeah, or whether that's actually government agents trying to confuse people.
It's an interesting take. I mean, I guess it makes sense if people can use social media. Of course, governments can use it. Jonathan, as a casual consumer of this, have you been watching things on Twitter? Have you been watching things on YouTube? Or do you find yourself kind of waiting for it to get a little bit more filtered and then catching that information through, maybe a CNN or, the New York Times has a great live blog where they post really informative, social media links. How are you kind of consuming this coverage from Iran?
I'm consuming it pretty much straight from Twitter, from YouTube, from those sources, and then I check the other media sources to see how much that confirms what I'm reading elsewhere, kind of judging how the media are handling the situation. Time magazine has appropriated a lot of the photos that you've seen in things like Flickr and YouTube, and they're starting to run their own photo galleries as well. So traditional media is following up on it. It's just not moving at the speed of things like Twitter. And I'm a Twitter junkie, yeah, so I'm following it. I'm refreshing all the time. And another thing about the Twitter feed, which is interesting to me, is that you start to feel like you know the person who's on the other end of that feed. You may have never met this person, but you feel like you have a personal connection. And now you've got a sort of a vested interest in that person's well-being, and it gets very emotional.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea of previously people feel like they know celebrities or TV figures, or they get that same emotional connection with those people. It's kind of interesting, like you say, that it's going down to the social level. I don't know, Cyrus, any parting shots on this Iran situation? Anything that you think that regular people maybe should know about?
Well, I think for all of the attention that's being paid on Twitter, and a lot of people, Twitter junkies and all the rest of us that are following what's going on in Iran, I think it's important to remember that some of the information that you see on Twitter, that it's important to take it with a grain of salt. It's important to verify what's being said on Twitter, just like was said a moment ago. I think that if you're seeing a Twitter message from somebody who's coming from CNN, who's coming from the BBC, who's coming from the New York Times, or some other kind of more established media organization, I think that has a lot more authority than just some random person saying, hey, so-and-so was arrested, so-and-so was shot, so, such and such demonstration is happening. I mean, there are cases where those people who are trying to give as updated information as possible, where that is credible, but I think it's just important to verify, as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. I mean, we're all kind of writing the playbook as we go along. In this situation, if nothing else, I mean, even if the election isn't overturned, or none of the protesters actually get the result that they're looking for, it's still a great handbook to the entire world about how social media can really impact and change governments. And I mean, more than anything, it's a really interesting situation, and I'm glad that we're able to actually see social media being used for something other than follow me on Twitter, so I'll have 30,000 Twitter followers, or all these other superfluous means. So guys, we're gonna leave it there because we're out of time. Jonathan Strickland from HowStuffWorks.com, thanks for joining us. Cyrus Farivar, he's a freelance tech journalist. Like he said, he's on PRI's The World later today, and you can check out all of his stuff. Do search Cyrus Farivar. He's kind of a big deal. Let's be real. No, just kidding. Thanks guys for joining us. I'm Randall Bennett. We'll see you next time. Later.